So good morning, everyone. My name is Veronica Velez, and I will share a little bit in a second about who the three of us are, but it was really important that we start today by recognizing that no matter where you're zooming in from, unless you reside within First Nations, you are on stolen land. We acknowledge all land as Indigenous, refusing to distinguish between federally recognized and unrecognized Indigenous nations, because the federal government cannot regulate indigeneity and home. In opening with this recognition, we do so beyond symbolic rhetoric. We ask all participants today to reflect on these two questions. What can exist beyond stating territorial acknowledgements? What else should have preceded these acknowledgements prior to the planning of this event? And secondly, what do these acknowledgements mean in terms of the everyday lived experiences of Indigenous people today? Chelsea Vowell, a Métis writer and lawyer best known for her work in promoting the protection and preservation of Indigenous languages in Canada, states, moving beyond territorial acknowledgements means asking hard questions about what needs to be done once we're aware of Indigenous presence. It requires that we remain uncomfortable, and it means making concrete disruptive change. For the organizers and presenters on today's panel, this opening is a fundamental call to action and frames the spirit of our conversation. And it is in this spirit that we also decided to organize using a slightly different approach than what many of you may be used to for these types of conferences. We believe that who we are as GIS practitioners, scholars, and aspiring activists deeply informs our geospatial practice. So as a panel of women of color, our understandings of the world imbue our geovisualizations, which is why we decided to frame our panel through a Pláticas approach. Go ahead and click, Maria. So the Pláticas approach is a uniquely Chicana Latina feminist method, which brings, and go ahead and click again, which brings center stage the multiple ways, the experiences of institutionally marginalized individuals, drawing attention to the multiple ways systems of oppression affect our daily lives and those of our communities, while celebrating our cultural ways of being and how we build, share our stories, and act upon the world. And I want to especially acknowledge the women and femmes who lead within the Mujeres Activas en Letras y Cambio Social, or an organization known as MOCS for short, who have amplified these practices to share with others. And I acknowledge their contribution to our panel. But before we begin our Pláticas, I would like to turn it back over to Clinton, who will provide us a bit of historical context for our conversation today.
And it really will just be a bit of historical context. We really want to, as quickly as possible, slip into the discussion. But I want to let you know that we've been listening for at least the past couple of decades. There have been a lot of folks who have been engaged with Esri, leveraging GIS to do the work of equity and social justice. And in the recent couple of years, we've been listening a bit more acutely. And through that listening, we understood that we wanted to, that you, the user community, wanted to engage in more discussions around this. So we brought last year to the UC a conversation about GIS for equity and social justice. In addition to that conversation, we also highlighted some of the work that people were doing in this space, in particular, some work by one of the women who will talk today, Nicole Franklin, about using GIS not just to say, hey, there's racism and let's assess the vulnerability of communities, but how do we measure and effectively take stock of our efforts to have an impact on racial injustice when we see it? And while all of that was happening, a group of people were organizing and brought together what we really accept as the first equity and social justice SIG at the conference in sort of a pop-up fashion right on the expo floor. And now that brings us fast forward to today, where we're in as a world, there's heightened awareness of some of what many of us all knew was to be real, that injustices along lines of race and racism have had a tremendous impact on communities of color, a devastating impact, has caused the loss of lives. We see it when we trace back even just the past few months of incidents of racial injustice, particularly against unarmed Black people. We also have seen it throughout the entirety of the pandemic, as it has disproportionately impacted communities of color, Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous populations to be specific because of long-standing pre-existing racial inequality. And so we brought to bear some resources to help organizations understand how Esri's technologies can be useful in helping you to advance your work of equity and social justice. And as a part of that, we have created a community that we see as an extension of these conversations, where you can take these conversations interactively all throughout the course of the year and engage in a discussion on the GeoNet site. And within the context of our guidance around racial equity, what we've really done is, again, listened acutely to the community of folks who are working to advance equity and social justice, and we've integrated into best practices for racial equity GIS, right? So we plug GIS into that so that we are empowering people to engage communities as they do the work of mapping and analyzing inequities, operationalizing racial justice best practices, and again, managing performance to ensure that their efforts are having the impact that they intend. And so now I want to hand things right back over to Vero to begin the pláticas.
So thank you, Clinton. So I won't get into too much about myself. I want to really focus on the plática itself, but just to share a little bit that, so I'm faculty at Western Washington University. We're located in Washington State, about 50 miles or so south of the Canadian border. Very different from the southern border near where I grew up in LA. And family back in Mexico that lived right across the border. But all that to say is that my work really looks at how we can bring some of the work of geospatial analysis and GIS directly into the work of educational inquiry, interested in looking at how race and racism impact the daily lives of students of color, their families and communities. But let me start by just, go ahead and click, Maria, thank you. I want to start, so my section in the Plática is to really engage us, and we had, so both Sophia, Nicole, and myself have had numerous conversations about the importance of how we center race and racism in our work. And we do this specifically to think about the structural geographic footprint of injustice. So we recognize that race and racism is endemic and permanent in US society. This means that our geospatial projects must begin with an examination of how race has been socially constructed in US history, and how the system of racism functions to oppress. And this is really an explicit project. Now, as a critical race scholar, studying race and racism has been core to my work. And I do this not as a conceptual or just theoretical, but as a very concrete reality. And this is also largely due to my training in social science. So I look for empirically how this plays out, and GIS has been an important part of my work. So in laying the groundwork for this GIS practice rooted in racial equity and justice, I will always stress the importance of first coming to understand how race and racism work. So with that said, I want to spend a little bit of time talking a little bit about the notion of the color line, which is a concept, I can spend all day talking about how racism are endemic, but the color line is an important notion that I think helps to foreground how structure works when it comes to racism. And I start with Du Bois, because Du Bois was the first one to coin this in 1903. And I think oftentimes when we engage in racial justice work, we can, it's easy to become sensationalized by a particular moment or event. So I will say that, the rise of the interest in racial justice didn't happen in the spring with the international uprisings to end Black death at the hands of police violence. Generations of Black, Indigenous, and folks of color have been talking about this. And so to go back to 1903, we realize, looking at Du Bois's work, how core the color line was to his analysis. And he states here, back in, to the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, that it is usually possible to draw in nearly every Southern community a physical color line on the map. The winding and intricacy of the geographic color line varies, of course, in different communities. I know some towns where a straight line drawn through the middle of the main street separates 9/10 of the whites from 9/10 of the Blacks. In other towns, the older settlement of whites has been encircled by a broad band of Blacks. And in still other cases, little settlements or nuclei of Blacks have been sprung up amid surrounding whites. Now, for me as a Chicana growing up in LA, I understood the color line intimately, as my family oftentimes drove past the white neighborhoods to get to the other side of the tracks, where we lived, shopped, went to school. We knew that these lines weren't just about demarking demographic variance, but we understood simply by living out our lives how our communities were bounded by streets and freeways that define difference in power and opportunity. So for me, navigating everyday color lines deepened already the pre-existing wisdom that my family held as immigrants to the US and as a child of immigrants growing up in what is a very largely immigrant community. But understanding that, these lines marked off good land from the bad, adequate housing, adequate resources from those that didn't. And we understood this very intimately as children growing up in these areas. So again, Du Bois's comment in putting forth the color line is something that for many of us, we lived every day and understood in a very intimate way and informs our practice. But let me get more concrete and let me share with you a series of maps that demonstrate that the color line is not something, and before I do that, I do want to signal for those of you who are interested in really understanding Du Bois's work around the color line, I highly encourage you to pick up this book, Visualizing Black America. It came out in 2018 and really shows how, although we could argue very rudimentary tools, Du Bois had some of the most stunning cartographic and infographic visualizations of Black America at the time. And it's a stunning book of those who are interested in learning more about Du Bois's work on the color line. But let me get into these maps. So these maps that I'm about to share with you are maps that I created to look specifically at one particular color line, which is the Alameda Corridor, which you see there marked in red in the middle of the screen. And this line used to be a rail track in LA, and later just became a sort of an important thoroughfare in that area. And you'll note that what I did is I normalized census tracts to the 1990 census tracts, so I can show these differences over time. And I created basically ethno-racial majorities within each of the census tract to mark how these communities change alongside each other over time. And you can see the blue is marked by majority Black census tracts, the kind of burgundy is majority Latinx, green other, the white is no majority, means that there wasn't a majority that made up over 51%, and the gray is white. So this is 1950, and pay attention to that Alameda Corridor. If you can go ahead and click next, this is 1960 LA. What you begin to notice is that what we can assume here just by looking at the line is that Blacks never crossed east of that line. Now, what that means is that we can talk about gentrification, we can talk about housing policies, redlining, looking at sort of covenants, racial covenants within deeds of homes and how that all impacted who got to move, where mobility was. But for me as an educational scholar, I was interested in the impact in schools. So here's, go ahead and click. In 1963, the Crawford case happens in this area, and the Crawford case was really the case that defined racial desegregation efforts in this district. Now, the consequence of the Crawford case is that the school board used that same Alameda corridor to define school attendance boundaries. So instead of actually trying to permeate the line, they use a line to determine who went where to school. So we knew that the two high schools to the east, Huntington Park and South Gateway, became majority white schools, and the schools to the west, the 5 high schools west of the Alameda corridor, remain majority Black. Now, history 70 years later, post-Brown, tells us what happened as a result of those desegregation or lack of success of those desegregation policies. And we understood that the educational opportunity was not distributed equitably across these sites. Now let's move forward to 1970, the next map, and you can see that line still holds. 1980, 1990, and then you see that the Latinx community begins to break some of that line. And part of that is due to the closure of several key plants. So Goodyear, some of the big kind of like automobile and tire plants closed down as a result of globalization. So the industries begin to change that take on much more informal economies. And that begins to impact the influx of Latinos to that region. Then 2000, and then finally 2010. Now I share these maps, in some ways are very simple visualizations, but the importance of this is noting the color line and beginning to ask very important geographic questions about the role of the color line and maintaining and ensuring that Blacks never crossed that line and why that was and the impact it had on different institutional contexts and the lives of those contained therein. And so for me, what's vital in this and that we continue to think through is that how we, in foregrounding the color line in our analysis and our geospatial projects, will make visible how the structural ways that racism works. I could have simply engaged race as a demographic variance and looked at how race plays out over different spaces according to different kinds of outcomes, whether they're educational, health-related, transportation. But because sometimes the data we use doesn't allow us to look at causality, we're looking at these patterns in a map and determining for ourselves what led to these conditions. The color line for us, and for me specifically, allows me to look deeply at structures and to say, what policies, what practices, what historical conditions led to this? This is not the fault of individual or moral failing of our communities and people within them. This is the fault of the policies that have sought to ensure that white supremacy would remain permanent to our society. So for me, and the last slide that I'll click here, is thinking really deeply about this report that was issued in Alameda County, which I had the opportunity to work in that region several years ago, issued a report and made this point very clear, that when we understand the geographic distribution of poverty, these are consistent with the geographic patterns of death and disease. And we know that for African Americans, Blacks, and Latinos, they're highly concentrated in high poverty areas that are the result of racist institutional policies that led to the physical separation of races. So how do we in our work continue to foreground the structural condition so that we don't just leave people to their imaginations to assume that we are at fault for the injustice that we experience? And that's a core part of moving from engaging or to move toward an anti-racist landscape analysis. And that's something that for me has been vital. So what I did now is I laid out a bit of the theoretical, one theoretical concept that I think could be helpful for us as GIS practitioners to think about how our work can move into this. But now, you know, in our conversation with Sophia and Nicole's work in particular does some stunning analysis to bring us into thinking about what kinds of specific frameworks, how do we shift the conversation to think differently so that when we think about the color line or think about how do we move into an anti-racist analysis, those things become more possible. And I think, Nicole, your work specifically around the institutional context is really vital here at multiple scales. And so I want to sort of turn to you, Nicole, and ask you, you know, can you help us understand a bit more about how your work helps us to think about these frameworks and really helps us bring forward some concepts that I think could be really helpful to our GIS user community. So Nicole, can you engage us now?
Thank you, Vero. As an activist and as a technologist, I strongly focus on leveraging and innovating technology to advance equity and social justice and invite others along. Why location matters? Because race and place matters. And as my colleague just articulated very beautifully, the reason why race and place matters is not due to the individuals that live in those spaces. And it's not done, it has not been done on accident. There were actual purposeful, intentional, racist policies, practices, and procedures that had us be able to think about race and place. So why does race and place matter? Race and place, unfortunately, determines one's life expectancy. This is due to oppressive systems like racism, sexism, heterosexism, and classism. Thus, location matters. Race and place matters. And for this conference and for the GIS professional and GIS folks using the technologies, we want to really be able to intentionally think about how are we going to innovate, leverage GIS technologies to have solutions to ensure that really the goal is that race and place does not matter on people's ability to thrive, but at this time it does. And so that's our call to action. That's what we're looking at. And it's also new. GIS for ESJ, from my body of work, really started in IT. And it was a strategic response to IT professionals saying that ESJ, racial equity, is not my work. We support those organizations and those customers that do ESJ and racial equity work. But as it's been laid out already in this presentation, GIS can be a powerful tool to create solutions for racial inequities and have place-based solutions. I would like to go over some foundational concepts we need to consider as we enter this paradigm shift to co-create an anti-racist society where everybody belongs. Words matter. Common definitions matter. And if we change how location matters intentionally, we will have a society that where we all thrive, where we all are doing better than what we're doing now. We'll talk about discussions of the unserved and underserved communities, which has been in the United States and other places around the world, have been intentionally subscribed to geography. So when we think about, maturing from being non-racist to anti-racist, we need to think about a few things. Non-racist says, we don't want to be racist. We're not doing anything now. And oftentimes is also talked about on a very interpersonal level. Being anti-racist says, I will not stand for it. I will undo it. I will take intentional actions to do something to undo institutional and systemic racism. And so we really want you guys to listen to our pláticas today and hear the call to action to lift up and gaze at the systems. And in particular, we're focusing on the systems of racism today. We've talked how racism and why racism is subscribed in our geography, and to undo systematic racism is a spatial analysis and will take spatial tools, which is why we see presenting at this conference a huge call to action to join together to make changes for the betterment. This is not simply technology. In addition, words that matter, the definitions matter, and our actions matter to invest where the needs are greatest. So this isn't just about saying we're going to show a map. We're going to use this spatial analysis or technique to be able to do it. We really actually have to have a foundation and an understanding of what it is that we're doing. And more than that, we need to take action. Creating a map is not simply action. Investing where the needs are greatest takes action. And it is important to understand that monitoring, tracking those actions is a methodology that we need to consider, consume, and repeat. And so we want to be able to look at not only where those places are, which I think has been kind of as long as I've been in government, the place to go to. Let's show the maps to show where the people live. Where are the unserved and underserved populations? And the key is we need to go further than that. We need to actually invest where the needs are greatest. There's lots of research that talks about a society's ability on thriving indicators really is key to relative inequality. And what that means is that the difference between the top and the bottom 20%, in any indicator that you want to talk about, whether you're talking about health, whether you're talking about education, any indicator that you would want to know about or care about, we want to decrease the difference between the top and the bottom 20%. You can, there has been research on countries and research on states in the United States, Wilkinson, that looks at the nature of relative inequality, and that absolute income or gross national product does not predict the social well-being or indicators of high social well-being for all in a society. But when you line it up to the relative inequality, the more inequality in a society, the less off we are. The more equity or relative inequality, the better off the society is as a whole. And to me, we have a large gap in relative inequality in the United States, and which is why we're seeing a lot of the outcomes at the societal level that are having us not thrive together. So it's not a us and them situation. It is a situation that we are actually co-created in the same fabric. And that even though we might try to push portions of our populations to a corner or a square or a place or a census tract on that fabric, we're still on that fabric together. And when that place unravels, so does the whole garment. So when thinking about that, we want to have targeted universalism and place-based solutions. Again, another opportunity to be able to understand the business drivers on this side and then be able to leverage GIS to advance intentional anti-racist agenda. Why do we lead with racial justice? As I said earlier, when we talk about race and place matters, it's not just racism. There's sexism, heterosexism, classism that play a big role in our relative inequalities. There's two reasons I'd like to point out for why we want to lead with racial justice. One is race intersects with every other system of oppression. And in fact, whenever you go into a system of oppression like gender oppression, as a woman, you will find that the data, the outcomes are greater for those people of color. And in fact, not only just if you're a person of color, but with lighter skin to darker skin, actually dictates your opportunities for success, right? I didn't say you couldn't be successful, but it does dictate your opportunities for success, the amount of stress that you have to deal with. The second reason is that knowing that information, targeting a race-based approach doesn't mean that we ignore everybody else, right? I think that's the fear of the white dominant culture, is that we will get the numbers and just flip the structure, right? We will now be oppressive to the white folks. One, that's not how we're built. And two, that's not the goal. The goal is that we all are in this fabric together. We all create the garment. Therefore, we all have to improve and decrease the inequities. In essence, increase equity so that we can all be more successful together and be in a anti-racist society, which in fact can happen. Okay, actually, I'm gonna have you go back one slide because I was still speaking to the first slide. Thank you. So equity and social justice is how we do what we do. And I say that because oftentimes we think it's, oh, how can we create this equity and social justice or racial justice program, right? How can we think about how we can go over here and in this space, create the space separate from everything else? But in fact, as I laid out, if we want to decrease relative equity, we need to look in all areas, right? So it's how we do what we do. Therefore, it's cross-cutting. It is not a silo, it cross-cuts all silos. And so there's two things that I want us to think about, especially for the techie people on the phone, on the call, listening to this platicas. Business drives technology, right? So the key is that we know that this is something that's said in IT often. But we have to understand, due to segregation, due to intentional acts of not having race, racism, whiteness, and white privilege in our K-12 curriculum, a lot of us don't know about this. And so we have to realize that that's a skill that we are missing, and to be better at doing our jobs, we're actually gonna have to learn about racism, race, white privilege, and whiteness. And it is important for us to know that to be able to do the work. And it's not just to work on these issues, really in every sector. We need to figure out how. It's not if, it's how is racism playing out in the work that we do. And if we don't think that it is, that just means that we haven't done the work to figure that out. And that is a call to action that I'm asking for today. And then once we have that understanding or work collaboratively, and again, we're not going to do this overnight. We're going to fail. It's going to be hard, and we're going to learn from it. So a call to continuous improvement, to leverage and innovate technology to advance equity and social justice, and racial equity and social justice. The other concept is information moves at the speed of technology. And we need to realize that. And when we just quickly have solutions that are not well thought out just to hit a checkbox, we actually could then institutionalize a whole nother set of harm to communities that are unserved and underserved without even knowing it. So it is important that we ethically look at the intersection and understand how to center and address racial issues in our work. And we want to do that to the needs and the desires of the unserved and underserved communities. Below are some examples of explicit anti-racist practices leveraging Esri technologies. To the left of the screen, we have King County's Anti-Race Hate and Bias Coalition, and I highlight there that it is a community-led initiative. That's important in doing this work. They are using Hub Premium and Survey 123. Asheville's Story Map that has won a GIS award around mapping racial equity. And then the methodology work that has been done around, and I want to be really clear about the methodology work, right? The tool is a tool. The methodology work of the equity performance management methodology and tools. The key is that we want to be able to measure, manage, and look at the difference between the top and the bottom 20%. And we want to be able to put and make targets for the quintiles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then manage our performance to that target. So it's not just saying a map, as we look at this one, here is the map where those who don't have or are underserved or unserved are. It's saying, and this is the action we are going to take. And we're going to take that together with public, private, and civic partners. The cartography on this is also intentional, being able to have the lighter areas be the areas where the needs are greatest, meaning the lighter amount of resources. So we want to be very intentional and thoughtful in our solutions. We've talked about this, Vero and Sophia and I, we talked about that it's not just a tech solution, right? You have to really have an understanding and co-create this with racial equity collaborators and practitioners. Okay, next slide. So equitable theory, practice, and investment that center and benefit community is social justice. So I wanted to really call out social justice separately because we say equity and social justice, equity and social justice. Equity is the practice of making inequitable spaces more equitable. It's the practice of intentionally decreasing the relative inequities, right? Social justice is changing those policies, practices, and procedures, taking the steps. That is the social justice part of it. Social justice is centering the voices of the unserved and underserved communities, not thinking about how we're gonna go help them do X, but asking them, what do you need for you to survive, for you to thrive, right? We need to move from surviving to thriving. There's a few things that I want to talk about shortly and then wrap it up, but I want to be really clear that we're centering on community here. There is a concept that we all have around diversity and inclusion, and it's been around for a long time. And I want us to think about maturing that to equity and belonging. We want to have sustainable diversity goals. I'm not saying diversity is a bad thing, but just the practice of traditional diversity and inclusion programs have not changed or moved the needle. It doesn't focus on changing any policies, practices, or procedures, which is social justice and is needed to create anti-racist society or to dismantle any system of oppression. Equity and belonging are the actions, so moving us from theory to actions. Equity, being equitable, creating equitable spaces are the actions, and belonging is the more mature space of inclusion. I do not want to be included in a racist, sexist, heterosexist society. I want to co-create that space where I belong. And so I'm also making a call to action today to consider having sustainable diversity goals and KPIs, but moving our concept of diversity inclusion to equity and belonging. And when we compare that to equity and social justice, again, equity and social justice is about being equitable in all fields, in all areas. And the social justice part is taking the steps and the actions to change the policies, practices, and procedures. As we can see below this week, Asheville approved systemic reparations for its Black residents. That is social justice. That is social justice. And it's going to look at the effects of slavery on Blacks and genocides on our indigenous populations. That is social justice. And when they do that, they will be doing equity. The last thing, theory to practice. This is not something that we can do alone. We need public, private, civic partners to advance equity for underserved and unserved communities. And the underserved and unserved communities is intentional. These communities have been intentionally underserved and unserved, and in the past, intentionally for racist purposes. And now we still live with the outcomes of those. So even though all of us today may be non-racist, meaning I don't subscribe to that belief, We have to realize, unless we're intentionally anti-racist, to take the actions to undo what's already been subscribed in our geography, we will still continue with racist outcomes, and we see that in the data. Benefits need to be defined by the communities that are unserved and underserved. And those communities are where the needs are greatest, and that's where we need to focus. And I'm ending this off and handing this over and asking the question of my colleague Sophia to talk to us more about centering community and the importance of being able to do that. So Sophia, regarding your work with the Dolores Huertas Foundation, share a little bit about engaging GIS and anti-racist work and what role in the community has with this work.
Yes, thank you so much, Vero and Nicole, for setting that up and giving us different ways that we can look at GIS for equity and social justice. And before I engage in my piece that really centers on community engagement and the importance of advocating and working with the community in the GIS space, I want to give folks a little bit of context of who I am and why I'm so excited to be on this call, that it is in existence. I started and founded the GIS department at the Dolores Huerta Foundation, and also am a co-founder of Spatial Commons. But really, I think what this whole presentation and with the racial and equity special interest group that was earlier is that this is a space that was manifested by the folks who are speaking on this call, by the folks who were in the back room of this call, and who really helped create this space. This is also not a space that happened with Jack's email to us a couple of months ago, or even with myself starting at the foundation 4 years ago, but we stand on the backs of a lot of our mentors and teachers who have come before us. So I want to give a little bit more history and context of why we're here. And thank you, Clinton, for that wonderful photo of last year. But really the beginning of equity and social GIS and the beginning of this movement with Esri being involved was in 2016. I had the very great fortune to be a part of a lunch meeting with Dolores Huerta, who is the founder and president of the Dolores Huerta Foundation. She is a social justice icon. She is 90 years young. And really her mission is to organize the world and to empower communities to speak for themselves and empower communities to pursue social justice. And Jack Dangerman, as everyone who's on this call should know, is also a powerhouse in his own right in the GIS space. And so why this was such an important meeting for myself to have this position and for all of us on this call to be here is that them meeting was really a call to action. It was a call to action to merge these two worlds and to really create and uplift equity, social justice, GIS in our space and to have it become a profession on its own. And so me beginning here and being a part of this call was really a collective call to action to all of us to use GIS to empower social justice movements. And again, I just want to echo what Vero and Nicole have been saying, is that we're not advocating for GIS people to come into these spaces and take over. We're advocating for folks that it's time to listen and it's time to meaningfully engage with our community. So we'll go on to the next slide. Please. So this next slide, it really is centering community participatory GIS, but some of you folks might be asking, what exactly is community GIS? What it really is we're asking that GIS professionals ground your work in community engagement and involvement to uplift community knowledge, otherwise known as locational intelligence, experiential knowledge, or lived wisdom. We're asking folks on this call to really deconstruct our idea and our notion that hard science, that data is really the gold standard. We're asking folks that, yes, it is a great base. We all use data. We all use census information, American Community Survey data, county data, the COVID-19 dashboards that have been shown throughout the conference. But what we're asking folks is, where's the community? Have you engaged meaningfully with the community? Have you spoken with them? Have you shown them the map? Have you asked them, does this really reflect what you're saying? With what Vero was saying earlier about she intimately knows her community. And that's all of us on this call. All of us intimately know where we lived, our neighborhood, know the streets that are a little bit more dangerous, the other streets that have better bike paths, and those where we need more resources put. And so we're asking you to ask yourselves in your work to center community and community knowledge. What that means is recognizing your privilege, all of us, whether we're Black, people of color. If you're in the GIS profession, you hold privilege. I hold privilege in this space, and to really recognize and wrestle, what does that mean when you intimately communicate and work with community? And that's a commitment to meaningful engagement, and a lot of that work is listening. So I know myself, I like to talk and I like to share my work, and a lot of us are really proud of what we do, but a part of that engagement is understanding when it's a space for us to step back, understanding that it's a space for us to listen to our community organizers, listen to our Black community, our POC community, and to really meaningfully enter into this space with respect. And a lot of that comes again with just listening to what they have to say to us, and having them look at the maps and giving us pointers. Some of these photos are just that. It's us taking the maps or engaging the concepts of spatial thinking and GIS with our community members. And a lot of the work that I do is just that, is asking them what they think about this. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So I would be remiss, and all of us would be remiss, to not talk about the census and the importance of the census. The census is still happening right now. Folks can fill it out until the end of October. Due to COVID, that timeline has been pushed back. And at the foundation, we are saying that filling out the census is an act of social justice. We do want to note and recognize that data has historically been used against marginalized communities, and has been used against our communities. We know that with the attempt to include a citizenship question by the current administration was really a direct attack on our Latinx community and undocumented folks. So we don't want to dismiss that, but we also want to note that the census means bringing in dollars. It means bringing in money to your community. It means bringing in $20,000 per person for a decade for your community. And so we want folks, and I challenge all of you guys to make sure that, one, you have filled out the census, but two, that you ask your family, you ask your grandparents, you ask your friends and your other households to please fill out the census so that we can use that accurate data for all of the work that we do moving forward. But we do want to note that the census is not the end all be all. It is the gold standard for a lot of the work that we do, but we are asking you not to stop there. Yes, to look at the demographics, look at where our folks live, look at who's counted, but also we know that our LGBTQ single folks are not counted. We know that this is the first time that the SIG community will be counted in the census. And so understanding that it's not perfect, but engaging that and creating your own data. And that goes back to the concept that we talked earlier about community engagement. So another piece in a lot of the work that we do right now is specifically around redistricting. And so once the census is complete, next year, every single district in the nation is going to draw their boundary lines based on new population information. And so what we're asking you, again, this, if you haven't noticed, everything on this call is a call to action. We're really challenging our community, our GIS professionals to really engage. We're not here for performative activism. We're here to get you all really wrestle with how we can use our time, our access to this information, to really do the work to help our communities. And we're specifically asking you to be engaged locally. So the map on the right was a map that I created in 2018. And what it shows is that the three triangles on the left-hand side are where three board members, white board members live. And this is with the largest high school district in the state of California. It represents over 38,000 students. Most of those students are students of color. And what this map represents, and it represents power, and it represents how our Latino community has been denied access to power on the largest school board district in the state. So yes, redistricting is not a sexy topic. It is, difficult work, but what we're asking and what we're asking folks to recognize is that, like my colleagues have said, where lines are drawn and who gets to draw lines is directly a product of institutional racism and who has access to power and whose power is being taken away. And so we're really asking folks to engage in this practice locally and to understand that redistricting should not be, these lines should not be decided by our politicians. They should really be decided by our community. And we need everyone to be engaged, because this once every 10-year line drawing is really sets the base for who can access power, who can become in power, and whether our communities get the funding that they need to really uplift them so that they can do the work of social justice work. And so I know we're going to end and we're going to go into more of a discussion, but the call to action that we have had throughout this entire presentation is for everyone to stop thinking about racism as interpersonal and start thinking of it as a structure. And so in all of our examples, we have talked about it, that it's not on a person-to-person level. We all live in a capitalist society. We all live within institutional structures, whether that's the nonprofit space, the academic space, or the government space, to really understand that we have a lot of work to do within these structures to dismantling racism, and that also all of us as GIS professionals have a lot of opportunity to really assist with that. But again, making sure that our work is grounded in community involvement and community engagement, but that we understand that we have a lot of learning to do, as my colleague Nicole said earlier, with the framework of having us better understand how to do this work in an equitable way. So I will end my comments right now, and we'll bring it back to Vero so we can just dialogue with our time remaining.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm pulling a little bit from the questions that you all are posing as we wrap this up. And again, this is partly at this point for the three of us to connect with the, we were meeting quite a bit before this, and also now connecting as we think through the intersections of the different components. But we talked about theory, we talked about institutions and structures, and Sophia really, I think. I wouldn't say it's coming at the end means it's the least important. I think it's the most powerful and most important component is really thinking about people and power in the work that we do and how do we center community. And I'm hearing a lot of different questions in the Q&A that I think link to each other about, so how do we do this? How do we get involved? What's the connection? Where do we start? And I think part of that conversation has to start. And I think, so as a professor, I have been very fortunate to learn from my students and their social media memes and hashtags and what have you. And I think I recently saw a hashtag or a meme kind of moving around social media that says the revolution will not be solved through implicit bias trainings. And I kind of had to hold that for a second, because I'm like, that's really dope. Young people are going to lead the world into the kinds of change that we need through these hashtags. But I will say that what that means for me, and where I take, I think, really an important imperative here, is that if you're committed to doing this, it does require you spend time understanding how these systems of racial injustice work. How does oppression operate? This is not going to be, 1.5 hour training where you're going to walk away and know all. I mean, these are fields of study. And I want to be careful here. I don't want to say that we need to engage in sort of an elitist university-based structure. A lot of our communities, as we've been sharing here, are holders and creators of knowledge. And if we invest in building those partnerships and we invest in continuing to see ourselves as learners of this work, and that has been crucial for all of us to think about the commitment to ongoing understanding of this. And I'll give one concrete example, and then I want to turn to my colegas here to kind of share a little bit more about these call to action that each of us are kind of to bring our session a bit to a close. When I was in Oakland, I had the opportunity to see how a GIS, very well-intended GIS professional, was trying to demonstrate what the city and the district was doing to shift the terrain for young people. Show these stunning maps where they were able to access, show how there's more green space and the more farmers markets and access to fresh foods, and it wasn't such of a food desert anymore. And the youth pushed back on the map, and they were saying, this map shows a very rich environment that we can't access, right? that we don't have the ability. So it's not, spatial justice isn't about things existing in space. It's about the ability for us to access those resources in space. Now, what the youth did is that they ground truth the maps to make us realize that the maps are only a starting point of this work. So GIS has to be in constant. So to Sophia, your work really helps me to think about these connections, right? To think about the ways that theory has to be in constant conversation with community, so that as we engage a geospatial analysis, a geospatial visualization, we're thinking deeply about what informs the conditions in the context of what we're facing. And at the same time, building off the community wisdom and collective wisdom of the young people, especially those at the margins, to help us understand what's happening in these spaces. But to Nicole, I know that in talking about institutions and structures, as we think about this call to action, and I'm hearing again, a lot of folks saying, where do we do, where do we start? How do we build? And there's a lot of questions around rigor. And how do we create a rigor analysis to engage an equity platform? What would be some things around a call to action that you would recommend to those folks that are asking those questions in the Q&A?
Yeah, I think the key is, and thank you, Vero, for your conversations and just so much insights. It's so interesting being on this call because we're learning from each other constantly. And I appreciate that from both Vero and Sophia. Anti-bias training, again, I want to get us in the space of maturing, continuous improvement, right? Let's not stay in decade-old, 5-decade-old processes. Anti-bias training is important, but it is not going to get us there. Being non-racist is important, but being anti-racist and intentionally deconstructing racist society, racist policy practices and procedures, and their policies and practices and procedures we did not create. So oftentimes our white colleagues do not see them as racist policies, practices, and procedures because we live in such segregated worlds where we don't interact except for maybe at work. And we don't choose to have these conversations. So conversations about race, monthly conversations about race, racism, whiteness, and white privilege with your colleagues so that you can build your muscle to have these difficult conversations and be able to actually talk about how that affects your work. And there are, again, lots of tools and techniques that are available. So Google search. I say that get consultants that do anti-racist work. It's very important that you're looking at the goal. There is a continuum for multi-racial and anti-racist continuum. So if you want to be an anti-racist organizations, you should get that continuum, Google it, and it'll be there, and you can figure out what you need to do. I think it's important to really be on the social justice side of equity and social justice, meaning it's not just about showing where it is. It's not about feeling bad about where we are. Blame and shame is not going to get us to where we need to be. It's about taking action and investing where the needs are greatest and changing our institutions and structures one policy, practice, and procedure at a time, and doing it in collaboration with public, private, and civic partnerships, centering and listening to community. And so with that, I would also love to turn it over to Sophia, who could talk a little bit more about power to the people, because as Vero said earlier, it's not last, it's last because it's the exclamation point at the end of this whole conversation.
Yes, thank you so much. So I do have a couple of things that folks can do right away. And one of the biggest things is to engage with your local community leaders. I'm not necessarily talking about politicians or people who hold political office, but to find those community organizations like the Dolores Huerta Foundation who are doing the work of community. We've seen the Black Lives Matter movement blow up across the nation, and that blew up because it was organized, that folks were listening to the organizers in the Black community, that there was a structure online, that there were toolkits, that there was information to how to safely protest, how to socially distance. And so it didn't happen out of anywhere. It happened because it was organized and people listened to the folks who were direct contact with communities and who have been engaging this work for a long time. So I just want to bring that back, that this work is not new. Again, we're standing on the shoulders. I'm standing on the shoulders of my ancestors and many mentors who have come before me. A lot of them, have sadly passed away now or will go unnamed. But again, I want you to challenge to find those community organizations locally who are doing this work and try to begin that relationship and begin that that space where you are putting yourself in a space of discomfort where you're listening. So that's a really big key thing that I think everyone here on this call is saying, is that we need to understand there's a lot for us to learn. And the GIS curriculum that I had and the academic institutions, we didn't dialogue about race. We didn't dialogue about gender. That happened because I took classes in a women and gender studies department. And so we really need to challenge that. And so on those, I do have some other things that folks can do. Spatial Commons, the organization that I'm with, is hosting a book club. And the first book that we will be dialoguing with Vero is actually one of the co-authors of this book. It's called Critical Race Spatial Analysis. So after you pick up the book that she recommended, I urge you to buy this as well, because like Nicole said too, we need to be in a space of constant learning and learning with text and best practices that are happening right now. And on the end for the work that I do, we are coming up with the redistricting community toolkit that will be launched in January of 2021. And so I know my personal call to action was for folks to be involved meaningfully in the redistricting process. And so we are really right now co-creating a toolkit that will be for GIS users, for those in the legal space, our community members and community leaders, and how do we meaningfully engage in this redistricting process? Because again, redistricting and maps, and this is just such a perfect example of the use of GIS for social justice is redistricting, because it is related to power. And so we really need all of you guys on this call to be engaged locally and to challenge our politicians when they attempt to make community voices undermined in that public space. So those would be my 3 things that you all can do right now.
Thank you, Sophia. And I know we're very quickly running out of time, and there are lots of different questions. And so we are putting a call to action to Esri to continue to create the beautiful platforms that Clinton and Margot and others who are part of the organization to continue these conversations with you. We know we hear the call in the Q&A to think about not just the US, but the global context. How do we understand things on a global level? Racism isn't just a US phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. And how are we thinking about our rural communities and who may not have the same types of access to the kinds of data that we're talking about here? How do we do that? I'm also hearing that it's also important to not forget that whiteness and white supremacy is a marked spatial location. So as we talk about what's needed in our communities who have been underserved and unserved by these institutions, how are we also not forgetting that whiteness and white supremacy also mark space in a very particular way? So it's important that we unpack that as well. And I'm hearing shout outs in the Q&A to organizations. Someone put out the Anti-Eviction Project. Yes, yes, and yes. There are these stunning grassroots examples of folks who are doing exactly what we're talking about here. We would love to create a space to continue to talk about those powerful examples who are engaging in GIS as a movement, not simply as a visualization. It's an activist call. And I think we're here to sort of bring that together. But I want to turn it back to Clinton and Margot too, because I know that there are other events that are happening today and tomorrow, and we want to be able to wrap up with letting you know about some of that information so that you can continue and please get in touch with us. Our information will be made available, so you can reach out to any of us to continue this dialogue, and we look forward to continuing it with you as well. So Clinton and Margot.
Thanks, Vero and Sophia and Nicole, for really great and important discussion. One that's much needed, and I'm glad that you were able to participate today.
Clinton, really quick, we can barely hear you. Can you speak in, maybe more into? There we go.
I should probably pull this down. Again, thanks, Vero, Sophia, Nicole. Really great and important conversation. Glad you were able to be here with us and guide us through this process today. Like you said, there's there's a rapid lineup right after this, the Women in GIS conversation, which is at its heart about workforce equity, gender equity. And after that, there's the Homecoming Blacks in GIS Special Interest Group meetup, which is again not only at its core about racial equity in terms of, the looking at the landscape of GIS, but the theme for this year is COVID-19 and an equitable disaster response. And then after that, there's a conversation being hosted by the Young Professionals Network that's helping people to really talk about race and racism in the workplace, and trying to figure out how to navigate through those conversations. So we invite you to and hope to engage with you in all of the rest of the conversations to follow, and look for us again next year and at other upcoming events.